Hello, and let me fix Mr. Camera. There we go. I don't want you to miss that. So, today is Thursday, November the 19th. Remember, we have a test tomorrow, and I suppose there's no possible way we can squeeze in another test by next Tuesday. It's just out of the question. Also, I'm thinking about doing the oh my, doing the that's my granddaughter doing the Google Meets to be more synchronous. I'm thinking about actually having you guys appear in a Google Meet, having a real Google Meet, and actually lecturing during the Google Meet. The guys up front are kind of pressing us to do that, and I understand why. Because, in a format like this, which is how I'm teaching a lot of my classes, a lot of students disengage, um, particularly ones who are not as savvy as you. On and that's the name of the game. Now, so what are we going to begin with today? Today, I thought we'd begin with, as it says there, we're going to talk about the writing process. And we're going to begin by constructing. And by the way, when I construct this, I'm going to do a lot of things wrong. For example, I'm going to use bullets instead of writing out paragraphs. But today, let's answer the question that you had over the weekend. Let's see, I almost touched the wrong button. And there. Okay, so you look here. Here is, of course, the question. Compare and contrast the motives. Okay. The first part of an LEQ is to read the question. Compare and contrast. Compare means how they are alike. Contrast means how they are different. Huh? Yeah. The motives and actions of Martin Luther in the German states and King Henry VIII in England in bringing about religious change during the Reformation. So what we're going to do here, we're going to write the essay. Okay. So once again, context. Context is the background of the question. What can we write here? Well, let's see. We can talk about the power of the Catholic Church prior to 1517. We could talk about the corruption of the RCC prior to 1517. We could talk about the you could make several sentences out of that first sentence I just put on there, and the same with the second. You could talk about the growth of national governments, national secular governments, and how they wanted a greater share of power. You could talk about who were and See, and all those things. I mean, who were Martin Luther? Martin Luther was a monk. He was born, raised in Germany. He became he got lost in a thunderstorm one night, and whatever. But there's all kind of things you could put in context. And once again, 3 sentences. Three. Some of you people had two. Oh, he'll take it easy on me because it's Mr. Horton. Well, I might and I might not. And I can't, but the thing is, I can't guarantee you that your reader will take it easy on you. But yeah, each one of those things you could write 3 sentences on and be fine. Okay, so the thesis. Let's talk about that. Shall we? Let me fix that. There you are. And blank, and blank. Word processing. Such a wonderful thing. So, the thesis. So, a sample thesis. Wow, this is where it gets tough, doesn't it? Not really. Um, and you were saying different. See, you know, you would fill the sentence in here. So, but you also remember, what does the question say? The question says motives, compare and contrast. Compare and contrast the motives and actions. Okay, different. This one is much easier. Wouldn't you agree? See? But also, Martin Luther wanted Okay, so you could definitely make thesis statement out of all this information or parts of this information. Do you have to have all these things in your thesis statement? No, but I mean, these are just ideas. And there are more right ideas out there you may have thought of yourself. Okay, evidence and support. So let's begin with Martin Luther because he was first. It always impresses to have dates. Wouldn't you agree? See, these are all evidences. Okay. See, this is all evidences. Okay, and complexity and reasoning. Okay. No. Okay. Okay. And so, yeah, and there it is. And look, okay. So here's your first paragraph. Here is your second and third plus paragraph. And here is your concluding. So, yeah, and basically there it is. You know, it's all about ideas and putting them in the right places and checking all the right boxes. And so, yeah, this would be a good guide. And basically, when you do an LEQ, same thing. Context, thesis, and this is context and thesis are in your first paragraph, right? Second, third, and if you have a fourth, if you want to bring in three bits of evidence, which I tell you to, this would be your fourth paragraph. And then your final paragraph, you talk about complexity and any conclusion you might want to say, you know. So, in conclusion, uh, Martin Luther and Henry VIII made changes that were different to bring out change, but also in making change actually did things that they didn't intend to, such as Martin Luther's religious movement became a political one, and Henry VIII's political movement started out as didn't really change the church at all, except for getting divorced. Okay, that was pretty cool. Let's talk about the transatlantic economy, shall we? Transatlantic economy. And this is all, once again, there are several kinds of history. There's political history, there's intellectual history, there's social history. This is economic history. And in a nutshell, this chapter is about mercantilism. Yeah, the 17th and 18th centuries were the era of mercantilism. Okay, so let's go. European contact with the rest of the world has gone through four phases: A, B, C, and D. Okay? The first was the European discovery phase of the New World. I hate that word. Why? Because, I don't want to sound like a bleeding heart here, but it's not truthful. Um, the European discovery of the New World was a little more than a military conquest. Yes, probably many more Native Americans were killed by diseases that were brought over by the Europeans, non intentionally, than were killed by acts of violence, but still, there was a tremendous, um, there was a tremendous number of, of Native Americans who died as a result of acts of outright violence. Basically slaughtering Native American tribes, hunting them into extinction, not only in North and South America, but the British and this is European, the British in Australia. I mean, the British for a while in Australia had bounties on the heads of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. At first, they tried to hunt them into extinction, and then they tried to kill them culturally, basically destroying their culture. And by the way, in the United States, we did the same thing. The original Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, where Jim Thorpe, the great All American Heisman Trophy winner, went to school, Jim Thorpe was Native American. But in the earliest days of that school, the purpose of the school was to take Native Americans, children, and to basically cut their hair, remove all evidences of their former culture, for example, worship of the traditional deities of the Native Americans, to make them dress in Western clothes, make them speak only in English. In fact, they would be punished for speaking their native languages. In fact, here Horton goes rambling again. Do you have to take notes on this? No, but it's an interesting story. Now, some of you may have heard about the wind talkers of World War II, which with World War II, the same thing happened here. But in World War I, there was a group of Choctaw Indians who were serving for the American Army in France. And a bunch of them were standing around and were talking to each other in Choctaw. And see, and an American officer overheard them, and the Native Americans got really afraid because they weren't supposed to, even in 1914, Native Americans were not supposed to be speaking their language in public, and especially not in the United States military. But the problem in World War One was, in communication in World War One, the Americans and the Allies and the Germans used telephones. They had telephones. Of course, they were wired telephones to communicate back and forth. But very quickly after they began using telephones, the Germans found ways to hack into their lines to, to intercept the transmissions. And so, what this officer did, he knew that Germans wouldn't know what Choctaw was. And so these Native Americans were then snatched up, and each American unit had a Choctaw Native American who would, that's how they would get on the phone and communicate with each other and give instructions so the Germans couldn't overhear them. But the whole point of that story was to bring up the idea that, at first Native Americans were slaughtered physically, and then they were slaughtered culturally. In fact, so much so, and this was so successful, that to this very day, Native Americans in this country lead every undesirable category in human existence in the United States. You say, what does that mean, Thornton? Native Americans have the highest percentage of unemployment. Native Americans have the highest percentage of illiteracy. Native Americans have the highest percentage of alcoholism. Native Americans have the highest percentage of drug abuse, and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Native Americans were especially hit hard with COVID, particularly the ones that live out in the reservations in places like Oklahoma and Arizona and Utah and Nevada, because they didn't have access to running water. Well, how do you wash your hands 20 times a day when you don't have enough water? And that was a problem. That was a real situation. Still is, actually. And so, yeah, so this discovery phase, I mean, I hate that word because it makes these European conquistadors and the British who came over sound like a bunch of Boy Scouts who were just, hey, you know, trust me, it was more than that. The Native Americans in the New World were looked upon as basically vermin, something that infested an area that needed to be gotten rid of. Yeah, I mean, we talk about what the Nazis did to Jews in Germany. Trust me. And I've thrown this stat at you before. When Columbus showed up in 1492, there were 4 million Native Americans living in North America. That's an estimate. Now, in 1900, the United States Census Bureau took the official census of the United States of America. And in 1900, there were 160,000 Native Americans. So from 4 million, 400 years later, to 160,000. Draw your own conclusions. And that's enough on that. So yeah, the European discovery, of the New World. The second was the era of mercantilist empires, which is what this chapter is about. It was one of colonial trade rivalry amongst Spain, France, Great Britain, to a lesser degree, the Netherlands, and Portugal. Like I said, to a lesser degree. These colonial empires, generally existed to foster trade and commerce. They did not exist to establish colonies to give their people a new place to live. That was an unintended incident. It also led to the creation of large navies that fostered a series of naval wars in the middle part of the 18th century. This included the element of African slavery. The Europeans, who certainly, Europeans were really torqued up about the fact that there was a lot of resources to be had in the New World, but they were not torqued up about the fact that gold and silver have to be dug out of the ground, that coffee and tobacco and potatoes and all those other crops, it takes work to get them out of there. And the Europeans were like, we're not going to do that work. And at first they used Native Americans, but between the fact that Native Americans began dying of one reason or another, one of those reasons was the fact that the Europeans had no problem with working those Native American Indians to death. No problem at all. That was one thing. And also the fact the Roman Catholic Church actually stepped in and said, you guys are killing, and speaking primarily the Spanish and the Portuguese, you guys are killing these Native Americans, working them to death, treating them so poorly. You need to stop it. And somebody, Portuguese at first, got this idea, hey, what about these African people here? They're not Native American. And the Roman Catholic Church said, okay. And thus began 400 years of legalized servitude. This was the largest forced migration in the history of mankind. Approximately, it is believed that in those 400 years, 10 million Africans were forcibly kidnapped and transported across the Atlantic to the Western Hemisphere. As it says there, another part of this, colonies from North and South America eventually emancipated themselves from their colonial masters. Eventually. Yeah. Part C. Now, the third stage, which is, we're not covering this chapter, occurred during the 19th century when European nations tried to carve out the imperial empires out of basically what was left of the indigenous peoples of Africa and Asia. Stats you need to know for this chapter, no, but going forward. In 1877, 1/10 of Africa was owned by European powers. In 1914, 9/10 of Africa was owned by European powers. 1877, 1/10. 1914, a mere 40 years later, 9/10 of Africa was owned by European powers. So, yeah. And also, of course, the British owned. Remember that at one point in time, and you're still writing, one point in time, that Great Britain, the so-called good guys, who aren't good guys, that Great Britain owned 25% of the world's surface. Australia, India, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, the Sudan, Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 25% was owned by Great Britain alone. And, then you get into the Dutch owned Indonesia, the French owned what is we call Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, the Spanish owned the Philippines, and then various other small colonies dotted here, there, and yonder. And so, yeah, the last period of the European empires occurred during the mid and late 20th century, meaning after World War II. And this was the decolonization of the empires. In other words, there aren't any more colonial powers left in the world. Even Great Britain has just a few dotted colonies here and there, like, for example, the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina. They had to give up India in 1947 and Hong Kong in 1997. And so, yeah, and that decolonization process is quite interesting. We'll talk about it later on. But look what it says, Part E. What allowed the Europeans to do this to the rest of the world was their technological superiority, yes. They had guns, germs, and steel. Yes, three things. Guns, of course, meaning guns. Germs, the Europeans brought with them germs that they had some resistance to. Native indigent peoples didn't have it. And eventually, the Europeans actually found ways to beat the native diseases, quinine and whatnot. Quinine, yeah. But anyway, and of course, steel. For example, many of the South Sea Islands that the British and other nationalities explored before Europeans showed up there had no metal. Think about it. A lot of the South Sea Islands, Borneo, places like that, Tahiti, before these Europeans start showing up, they didn't have metal. And it's kind of an interesting story that, for example, when Magellan first shows up in 1520, I think it was. Yeah, 1520. Yeah. They bumped into some of these islands where they quickly found out that the native women of these islands would exchange sex for nails that were used to hold the ship together. Nails. And so in the weeks that Magellan's ships were docked there, suddenly all the nails on board began disappearing. And not only that, these sailors began pulling them out of the ship to the point where the ships were becoming unseaworthy. And of course, Magellan had to put an end to that practice. But yeah, the point, and so the bigger point is that these indigent peoples did not have steel or even metal for that matter. Roman II. Navies and merchant shipping were the keystones of the mercantile empires that were meant to bring profit to a nation rather than to provide areas for settlement. Yeah, the fact that by 1750, 1 million Englishmen were living in the 13 colonies was an unintended effect. They had no idea it was going to take off like that. Except for Brazil, Spain controlled Latin America and Florida. These are good things to know, to have kind of a ballpark grip. So, except for Brazil, Spain controlled everything south of the Rio Grande. And in fact, to be honest, at this point in time, Spain actually controlled the western third of the United States: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. That was Spanish territory until the Mexicans took it over, and then the United States beat up the Mexicans, took it from them. But yeah, they Spanish controlled Latin America, everything south of the Rio Grande, and Florida, except for Brazil. Britain controlled most of the area of the North American eastern seaboard. The French controlled the middle third of America, that's Louisiana, and many of the Caribbean islands for their sugar. The Dutch controlled Indonesia, or the East Indies, which were valuable to the Dutch for spice, and a few other strategically placed islands and colonies like Suriname. Say, where's Suriname? Suriname is on the northern coast of South America. Okay, part 3. Mercantilism was an economic policy, and it was a bad policy, that dictated the actions of these empires. And look what somebody wrote down for you. What mercantilism is. The primary goal of mercantilism for a country was to acquire gold and silver bullion, meaning gold and silver in its purest form, so you can take it and do other stuff with it, like make coins or jewelry. A nation that amassed more gold and silver bullion was considered more powerful than its rivals. It was assumed that the wealth of one nation was assumed to grow or increase at the expense of another. This is called, by the way, zero sum. That for me to improve, you have to lose. And that simple idea will cause many of these wars of the 18th century, that they're colonial wars. Colonies were meant to provide markets and sources of raw materials for the mother country and not to compete with her in that regard. I mean, once again, the American Revolution, and you can read all your quaint little history books about, George Washington and freedom of speech and all this kind of good business. But the simple fact of the matter is that the American Revolution was caused by mercantilism. And basically, it was rich American guys, farmers like George Washington, were not making as much money as they thought they should because their products, tobacco, cotton, etc., 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 which of course they had slave labor to produce, all those things, the British, through mercantilism, set the price for those things. And the colonies had to sell to the British. Oh, they were supposed to by law, a lot of smuggling going on. And yet the colonists could not make any money because the British kept the price artificially low so that the people living in Britain could make more money. All right, so mercantilist ideas were always more clear in paper than in practice. The colonial and home markets oftentimes simply didn't fit each other. In other words, what the colonists needed, oftentimes the mother country could not supply. Colonies of different countries, for example, the colonies in North America and the colonies in South America and the Caribbean, wanted to trade with each other. Remember once again that this country uses the dollar as its basic form of currency, not the pound. Even though that this country was a British colonial possession in its beginnings, and the British used the pound, still do actually. It's a really strange currency. But the Spanish used a denomination based on 100 metric system type. And the Americans smuggled so much, and this is because why? Because the Spanish would pay in silver. The British kept a coin shortage. They forced the colonies to not be allowed to have much money. They couldn't print their own money after 1689, and the British suppressed the prices. Uh, but the Spanish would pay in silver. And that is why, number one, that in the United States, the dollar, based on 100, is the currency. And also why, until 1859, Spanish pieces of 8, Spanish coins with the dollar symbol on them, I showed you that, were legal currency in the United States of America until 1859. And yes, this will usher in the 18th century as the golden age of smugglers. Yeah. Talking about Britain and the 13 colonies again. Yeah, I mean, think about it. Today, this country possesses satellites, surveillance cameras, the United States Navy, the United States Coast Guard, the FBI, the DEA, and all sorts of agencies whose simple job it is to keep contraband out of this country. And are they successful? Answer: no. So what chance do the British have in the 18th century? Particularly when you're talking about the eastern seaboard of the United States is just networked with little coves and inlets and, things that places where smugglers can hide, slip in at night. And so, yeah, the golden age of smugglers. And once again, American Revolution was about money. Okay. All right. Roman IV. The British and the French quarreled endlessly over the colonial empires, with the British, who were supplanted by a superior navy, finally triumphing after a series of costly wars. I mean, yes, the War of Austrian Succession, the War of Spanish Succession, the French and Indian War, all those wars are very expensive. Their colonists, the French and the English colonists, fought over trading rights, property rights, allegiances with the Native Americans. The French in North America actually got along better with the larger Iroquois Native Americans. Algonquin, I'm sorry. Yeah, Algonquin. Yeah. And the British and the Iroquois, in North America, there were two main families of tribes, the Iroquois and the Algonquin. Now, once again, those are not the names of tribes. Those are the names of families of tribes. And the French, because their method of making money, which was trapping furs, didn't conflict with Native Americans' method of commercing their life, which was fur trapping was part of it. I mean, the Native Americans could trade with the French, even though the French tried to trade with them for alcohol and wampum and other trinkets. But anyway, the French got along better with the majority of the Algonquin tribes, whereas the British, the Iroquois, who were traditional enemies of the Algonquin, sided with the British so that they wouldn't be left out hanging. So, at the heart of this 18th century colonial rivalry lay in the West Indies lay in the West Indies, where the following commodities grew in abundance: tobacco, cotton, indigo, which is a dye, a deep blue dye, coffee, and the biggest, sugar. Yeah, sugar was next to slaves, of course. Slaves were the most profitable trade item, but the most profitable legitimate trade item, when I say legitimate, even when slavery was legal, people looked down their noses at slave traders. They were called blackbirds and all, birders and all these kind of things. Uh, they, but they're also called rich because the slave trade was quite lucrative. But the biggest lucrative type of trade was sugar. Yeah, sugar. Sugar, Europe quickly developed a massive sweet tooth over cane sugar. Yeah, cane sugar. It was good because it could be transported once it was granularized, and the Europeans couldn't get enough of it. They really couldn't, especially combine it with a little bit of chocolate, but sugar on its own. Because you have to remember that during the Middle Ages, they didn't have a lot of ways to sweeten their foods. Honey, but bees kind of protest. Anyway, so we're going to stop here in a second. The British East India Company. The British East India Company, they were a private company that actually will rule India until 1858. But yeah, the British East India Company and the French Compagnie des Indes, which is a French trading company in India, dominated the trade in India. The original European footholds in India were trading posts called factories. And, the British, particularly the British East India Company, will move into India kind of like a mold, meaning that, they'll set up a trading post. And to protect the trading post, the British company would bring in soldiers that they paid for and commissioned, and began taking more and more territory. As time went on, both these companies began to take the governmental control in some regions. Yeah, and like I said, with the British East India Company, it'll be until 1856. Why don't we begin with Roman numeral 5 on Monday? Tomorrow you have your test, and in class I'm going to talk about art. When we have our Google Meets, and it's worthwhile knowledge. All right, and so with that, I hope that everybody got something out of the day, particularly the writing process. Help with that. I mean, I was kind of taken back by the fact that some of the essays I got were like one paragraph, and one big paragraph, but still, you need to separate your thoughts into paragraphs. But yeah, and so yeah, I'm gonna let you guys go, and we'll begin with Roman numeral 5 Monday. Have a good day. Bye now.